very much, guys. I'm going to just briefly, I see hands already, I'm just going to briefly abuse the chair a little bit to just pick up on this last bit. I'd like to be a bit provocative from Murray's last windup, because I actually very much agree with how he wrapped that up, that this UNPRI, the document that's going around and what he summarized, is kind of the moment. And in fact, just to expand briefly, I would say that many of the people that are engaged around pension issues in the labor movement are very enthusiastic about the emergence of this set of principles. I think there's debates and so forth, but it does reflect what I would suggest a lot of trade union people consider to be a kind of a victory after years of working to try to normalize or gain acceptance of notions of responsible investment into sort of the mainstream of investment thinking. I think it is widely viewed as a victory and an invitation to continue to press forward. And if I could, just to be a bit provocative, I would like to flag my doubts about it, just very briefly, and maybe to stimulate some debate about it. Because probably if you had told me that this, what Murray just described, institutions representing trillions of dollars are signing on to what seem to be principles of responsible investment, this sounds like such a fantastic, earth-shaking change of direction for modern capitalism in some ways. I'll just flag the couple of points that raise deep concerns for me, which I don't think is talked about enough. And I'll just do it very quickly, and we'll get into some questions. Number one, as Murray just flagged, it is fundamental and intrinsic to these principles that their exercise is an exercise of the duty to seek maximum financial returns at minimized risk. That is still there. This is not a divergence, and in fact, as Murray put it, it's an incorporation of what had traditionally been framed and termed non-financial considerations, and it's essentially making them financial. It's saying we can consider these things, but really only if we can clearly demonstrate and make a case that this will have an effect on either our returns or our risk profile. If we can't do that, it's not in this world. That's one flag I'll make. It's probably the most important. Secondly, and Murray didn't talk about this as much, or at least it didn't come clear to me, this is a voluntary framework. This is not a regulation. It's not about setting up laws. It's not about setting up rules. It's setting up a set of principles that a set of institutions are being invited to sign on to and voluntarily respect. Those of us in the labor movement know about self-regulation and voluntary frameworks of corporations and employers. And I think we've got good reason to be very skeptical about a framework like that, which leads me directly to the last point. As a voluntary framework, but one that's embracing, I would say, importing non-financial issues into a financial, essentially profit calculus. That's what makes it not surprising to me that you have all of these huge financial institutions saying, oh yeah, we'll sign up for that. We don't see a threat here. To my mind, if the dominant financial institutions that are running this world don't see a threat in an initiative like this, I think we have a problem. This is at least my instinctive response. So I throw that out just as a tack on to hopefully generate some further discussion. I'll shut myself up now.
SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, they work closely with corporations to develop these standards. So for example, you'll have a large corporation that produces waste. They'll measure how much goes to a landfill. They'll measure how much they emit carbon-wise. They'll measure how much they dump into how much water they use, environmental standard. They'll measure these things, and the interface between this new sort of sustainability accounting board in the corporate world is that they figure out what they can measure, and they can't measure child labor, I agree with that. But they can measure energy use, they can measure waste, they can measure water consumption, they can measure carbon emissions. And they can report on those things. And if SASB develops uniform metrics for these things, everybody's reporting on them, then you can compare. Now, from the corporate point of view, what they're interested in is reducing their costs. When you use less energy, it costs less. You throw less into a landfill where you have to pay per unit, you save money. I mean, there's a confluence of interests. So they're not in conflict on issues like that. And so that's where I think where you're going to see those kinds of metrics emerge. You're not going to see them in regard to child labor.
So if they're in the interest of the corporation anyway, say what?
But when you get into the environmental space, which is driving a lot of this, there can be a confluence. And to the extent that corporations are genuinely concerned about carbon emissions, genuinely concerned that governments are going to restrict carbon emissions at some point because of the threat of irreversible climate change, then they back up and they say, well, if that happens, we're in trouble. How do we adapt or plan for that? So I think the answer to that question is that you look to the interface, the common interests between the corporations and this school of thought to find out, to identify those low-hanging fruit where everybody's sort of happy if you use less energy and less water and so on and so forth. Now, I think the big point is to recognize the limits of these institutions. What's striking about the PRI and what's striking about all the SASB and all the conferences that happen all over the place on these issues.
Lots of conferences.
Lots of conferences, big industry, is that government is not present. The government representatives are not invited, government representatives do not speak, government representatives are not present. Right? This is an initiative of the financial sector, at least the pension component of the financial sector, and to some degree it draws in attendant professionals and cooperating corporations. Government is absent. So this is an effort to regulate in some way, and I use that word mistakenly, to regulate social conduct without government, by creating some form of concerted pressure to change. And really, one way of thinking about it is that pension funds have long liabilities, go on for a long time, can be here for a long time. They can afford to adopt a long-term perspective, or they should, often don't, but they should. Whereas corporations are driven quarter to quarter. They've got a survival criterion, they've got reporting criteria, they've got bonuses to pay, and they're measured against short-term metrics. And the most charitable way of looking at this is that the pension institutions, with their longer-term view, are trying to drag the corporates into some kind of sustainable capitalism model that can endure for some period of time. Because people are frankly afraid that all this short-term focus and all the, especially environmental damage that's being done, means that this is not going to last. There's too much pressure in the system. So I think one way of looking at it is that whether through the expansion of fiduciary obligations, this notion of a public fiduciary, these institutions, these pension institutions, owners begin to wield some kind of influence on large corporations to change their behavior, to sustain the system at large indefinitely. And the real problem, the real issue with this is that you have to ask yourself, even with the best will in the world, even if they were genuinely and thoroughly committed to the PRI, even if they had a strong view about global warming and what had to be done, are they in a position to actually change in a fundamental way the behavior of corporations in which they invest? Right? And I think one has to sort of step back and ask, is this the role of pension funds, or is this the role of the state? If anyone's going to do this, historically it's been the state that has regulated, for example, the environment. But as the state has withdrawn from virtually every form of regulation over the last 20 or 30 years, you've seen in this indirect kind of way, and these ideological rubrics, these pension funds try to fill that space kind of weakly, but even if they did so forcefully, could they? Is this the right role for them? Or is this just a category mistake? Is it just a category mistake to think that a pension fund, or a bunch of pension funds, a group of pension funds, national or international, can change the course of global warming? Is that the role of pension funds? Or is it the role of the state? I think that's the big question. If there's any fundamental confusion in this area, that's it. That all of a sudden, but over the last number of years, pension funds have moved into this space. Governments moved out of this space. The state has absented itself from a lot of this, especially in North America.
Kyoto.
And yep,
Interesting.
is this does this make any sense? Those are my comments.
Yeah, either of Simon or Joanna join in on that or other of the questions posed.
The sort of the time bomb or the unsaid part of Mr. Gibbons' question is that if it isn't if it isn't cost effective for a corporation, it won't be measured and it won't be taken into account and it won't be accounted for. It's an accounting problem in a sense. And if your core constituency is labor and your idea of what a good world is a collectively bargained fair wage world, then this doesn't hold out really that much hope, right? I mean, and I think you had a session on this a year ago, and so that's the fatal sort of part of that is when I look at it. So it's, well, maybe that's what I want to say.
Joanna?
Sure, I may not weigh in on that one, but I will weigh in on some others. I mean, I think there does need to be a discussion around do we need maximal returns or do we need sufficient returns? And that's something that trustees need to think about, and that's something that beneficiaries need their trustees to think about. You know, it's the same decision making we do. You put money away for a rainy day. You know, unions put money in their strike funds. How do you know when enough is enough? But surely there is some idea of when enough is enough. And so, you know, you want to have good returns, but surely there's a bit of buffer there. And there are some pension plans and some boards of trustees that are starting to talk about that a little bit. So they're changing the language a little bit away from maximum returns to good returns, good enough. Reasonable returns. And it's a little semantic, but you know, that's one way that you can start trying to move the discussion a little bit, perhaps. A lot of trustees, the concepts of, you know, ESG, SRI, whatever you want to call these things, they're not at the board. They don't talk about it, you know. But when I ask trustees, and so do you have conversations about socially responsible investment? No.
No, it's just not talking about it.
No, it doesn't even come up. Some boards would say, oh yeah, we had a presentation one time, some guy from Share came, no, whatever. And what labor trustees say is that Share is actually seen as quite suspicious from the most part by employer trustees. They're seen as a labor-friendly group, and when they come in to give a presentation to the board, it's kind of like, okay, nod, 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 nothing's gonna come of that. So that's a challenge if the concept of alternative investment is linked to a labor issue and that is being derided by other people at the board, that becomes more of a hurdle.
Joanna, can I just ask you to explain who SHARE is, just because not everybody
Sure.
will know?
So they're I don't even know if I know the acronym. It's
I know. It's the Shareholder Association for Research and Education.
There you go. It's a group that operates out of British Columbia that do a lot of really good education work with primarily unionized union pension trustees around some of this education. They do a lot of education around shareholder activism more generally on some of these topics. So that's a group that is doing work, but doesn't seem to be permeating the trustee mentality that much. Other examples of this, I was telling Kevin earlier, around this idea of P3s, like it's front of mind for public sector organization or trustees and unions to be like, these are not what we're interested in. I had a conversation with a labor trustee who's on a buildings trade board, and he didn't care in the slightest. He was perfectly happy to have his pension plan invest in the building of P3s if they're using unionized labor. So he was happy for his interest, but that broader sense is not there. And that's a challenge, and that's a perennial challenge for the labor movement, is building those bonds across unions. But that's another example of how the thing is actually being dismantled rather than being built up. And sometimes labor trustees are part of that problem. Around how you engage your own trustees, make them talk to you. I don't know. Some trustees have given presentations to union general meetings, especially when some more contentious decisions were being made. So invite your trustees to things. Have them explain themselves in ways that aren't this cryptic piece of paper that doesn't come from your trustees. It comes from the pension staff, and they don't know how to write anything that makes any sense to a normal individual, right? So forget that. Those are useless to you as members. Those are useless to plan beneficiaries. Make your trustees communicate to you in ways that you understand, and that's something that you can do. Phone them up, right? Phone up all of them. Don't even just phone up your own labor trustee. Phone up the employer trustees too.
They want email so they can go to the administrator.
That's right. I can't say anything to you right now. I don't want to say anything wrong. And I would encourage your trustees to have a conversation amongst themselves about the vision of the board. And some boards do this. The Ohio State Teachers Plan. They have board retreats on a regular basis where they actively engage in a visioning process for the board. And it's quite useful, I think, where they talk about their common ideas, their common agendas, and some of this gets hashed out. That you don't have time to talk about this stuff at the board table. You don't have time to have a debate at the board table. So maybe you can compel your board of trustees to make space to talk about these issues a little bit more. Some of the issues that constituents bring up or that are brought up as conflict issues at the board, is that, I think, what your question is?
Who are they? Sorry for being...
Yeah, so, I mean, most often constituents, so the beneficiaries are the constituents for a labor trustee. Plan members. But if you're an employer trustee, your constituent is the company in a strange way. So it's different, but they're still the group that puts you on the board. For independents, they have less of a constituent group. Although if you're a trustee who's sitting for the Secretary of State, for example, in the U.S. states, and oftentimes they have an ex officio seat on public pension boards, that person is their constituent. Government is their constituent. So what does government have to say about all this? So those are the constituents they have. It's most easily conceptualized for labor trustees because their constituency is bigger and is more diverse. Yeah.
Okay.
One thing, just to put the pension world in some perspective, most pension funds today are underfunded, which means that if you compare the assets they have to the liabilities they have, in other words, the commitments to benefits, they don't have enough. They've got less money than they have liabilities. This is the preoccupation of pension trustees. What are we going to do about this? Today. And has been for probably the better part of this decade.
But sharper today.
Sharper all the time. So in this world where you have chronic shortfalls, the primary driver at most board tables, and there are people who've sat at board tables, and they'll correct me, I know if I'm wrong, is to deliver the benefit, the retirement benefit that the membership expects. And if you go to them and you say, you know what, let's talk about the general social thing that's going on, or this social issue or that social issue, they will be interested. They're human beings. They're good human beings, some of them, and some of them they're not so good human beings, but they're Their primary mandate, and the way they understand their fiduciary obligation, as a lawyer I can't disagree with them, is to run the fund in a way that will deliver the benefits to the best extent that they can. That's their mandate, that's what they are, and that's, sort of coming back to this fundamental question. They are not constituted as social reformers. They're not constituted as governments. They don't have the power to regulate. They don't have the power to control. They have some influence in some spheres sometime. Working together, more influence than working apart. But their mandate is to manage an investment fund to pay people retirement pensions. And they're not huge pensions. In the typical public sector plan in this country, and that's the top group of plans, pays somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000 a year. More for teachers, less for others, varies. It's not a fortune. And none of them have enough money to do it right now. So they are feeling the pinch, bearing down, and focused on investment returns and risk. That's what they're focused on. And that's their job. That's how they're constructed. So I think it's, it's a little bit utopian to think that pension funds are going to perform this much needed social function, save us from global warming, or save us from social crises, or save us from this or the other thing. That's not why they're there. It's not why they're constituted. And if you look at the way fiduciary obligations work, if people sitting on top of $120 billion go out and start spending it to make the world a nicer place, but it depletes their pension fund and they can't pay their pensions, they'll go to jail. That's not what they're there for. So,
Why is there the gap, Larry?
oh, that's a. There's,
Right or what?
part of the
funding
gap.
gap.
Funding
The
gap.
Funding
deficits.
gap. The funding gap exists for different plans for different reasons. But the primary driving force today is the way that we value pension liabilities, and especially the relationship between pension liabilities and interest rates. So more or less, when interest rates go down, pension liabilities go up. That's because of the way it's measured, which we can talk about for a long time, and not make a lot of sense to people, but that's how it is. So with historically low interest rates, pension liabilities are at historically high levels. And it's more that than anything else. I mean, to a certain extent, the meltdown in 2009 hurt a lot of funds, lost a lot of money, crashed, lost a lot of money. But really, if you look at financial markets since then, they've largely recovered and then some for the most part. So it's mainly interest rates. To a certain extent, people are living longer than expected, so pension liabilities go up for that reason, but mainly it's interest rates.
And it's also a challenge because that liability window is so long, right? I've heard trustees say, jeepers, can we really, do we have to talk about the liability so far in the future? If we pull back on that window a little bit, we actually look solvent. But because of the way it's defined, it sometimes looks much worse on paper. And that's my very layperson understanding.
Simon spoke about this other formulation of a different kind of public interest investment approach under this label of universal ownership, and mentioned Monks and Minnow. There's another work that came out in 2000, Hawley and Williams, I think, the authors. And I just read something by those authors on this concept. And they described it in very much the way you did, universal ownership, investment funds that hold essentially securities from across the economy. They'd be affected by the whole macro economy. They have to look at things from a broad macro political and economic perspective, and that should be different than evaluating individual securities. Which sounds so positive. They said, so they've got to be concerned about things like government public policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, taxation policy, employment policy. This sounds like it's got potential for something really progressive. Maybe even what we would consider to be traditional sort of welfare state Keynesianism is what the pension fund should be doing. But then I noticed in this article that one of the very few examples of a specific public policy that they thought might be an automatic sensible one for large investment funds to advance and promote was trade liberalization. As you know, an obviously good public policy for the public and the world of investment. And as soon as I saw that, I realized, well, this is troubling, right? Because saying that you're going to represent the public interest and advocate good public policies doesn't tell us which ones are good. And this is the political debate, right? So I just put that to Simon, because I find that immediately troubling and entirely delegitimizing for that whole framework. The second one is more to Murray, coming out of the exchange about UNPRI and so forth. One of the things we haven't talked about, and we haven't talked about in the previous sessions yet, maybe we'll get to it, that I find deeply troubling is the emergence of private equity, basically. A lot of us think of pension funds as large institutions that invest in stocks, shares, and bonds, essentially, the traditional kind of securities markets. But especially with the large mega funds, what we're seeing is the emergence of, they're moving beyond, they have moved well beyond that, especially in the last 15 years, moving into very different worlds of hedge funds, derivatives, and specifically of interest in Canada is private equity, meaning that they're no longer buying shares and have that arm's length relationship. They're buying companies outright and running them, naming the boards of directors. And OMERS, one of the very significant players in Ontario and Canada and globally, they have been phasing in their share of their assets allocated to private equity up to 47%. Almost half of the fund, a $60 billion fund, is going to be private equity.
That's not right, actually. It's real estate, private equity, and infrastructure. Private equity is only
But all of those
together.
as private equity,
Together.
right? But all of them comprising no longer public market securities, right?
Correct.
And just the illustration that I just find so troubling, and there's so many examples, but there was, and I know Brian knows about this, there was an extreme case that is worth us all knowing about, probably not widely known, where OMERS and the Caisse de dépôt, large public pension fund out of Quebec, bought a manufacturing plant making shopping carts in Montreal, employing 400 unionized steelworkers, a unionized plant, long established. They bought it outright, 50-50, private equity, so they owned it completely, not shares. 3 years later, this was in 2005, 3 years later, they announced to the steelworkers that costs have changed, configuration, the situation has changed, and unfortunately, your unionized plant in Montreal is going to have to be shut down, and we're relocating the production to North Carolina. This is now normal, I think, in these worlds. I don't think this is an exception, at least if it was at the time. I think this is what we should anticipate is coming increasingly, and I guess in the context of fiduciary duties, ostensibly guiding pension representatives, and our people that we put on these boards, now attempting to oversee direct ownership in this neoliberal world where this is now normal. This is what is happening. I guess I would just put to Murray, OMERS and the Caisse are signatories to the UNPRI. And I don't think anybody in these worlds would think that plant closure and relocation to a right-to-work state had any conflict with responsible investment principles. There's no conflict. So I put that to Murray.
Okay, so what does, I think, divestiture mean for actual workers?
And sorry, I should just say this is probably our last go around. So
Okay.
if you have any final thoughts to tack in, please do.
I mean,
the last few
typically,
minutes.
if you're a worker and a beneficiary of a pension plan, and your pension plan decides not to invest in A, but to invest in B, that has absolutely no effect on you potentially. If your trustees say, well, B is better or B is different, then that's fine. and trustees are making that decision all the time. Nope, don't want to invest there for some reason, we'll invest there instead. I think the nuance with this was that what, I suppose, do the workers of a company who has been dropped as an investment, what's the impact on them? It gets more complicated. Jim was saying last week, nothing, because no money is made on those shares anyway, so maybe nothing. Maybe a new investor comes along, but there's quite a bit of division there, I think. Examples of companies divesting, I don't know any examples, I'll defer. Preparation of trustees is limited. There are some unions doing some education programs that are excellent. There are some trustees who are taking it on their own initiative to take a whole host of investment courses, but that's typically on their own initiative. There's not a lot of training. In terms of accountability and reporting back of labor trustees to unions, very, very little. Much of the time it's, yippee, see you later trustee, out you go. And if there is a lot of reporting back, then you get into the murky ground of, well, then are you doing what the union wants, or are you filling the fiduciary duty of the plan to the beneficiaries? So that's a dangerous ground. I think there is an argument to be said that if a union is going to put a trustee on a board, they need to get behind that trustee. They also need to keep tabs on what the trustee is doing. But it gets constrained because a union can't also completely set an agenda for the trustee. And I've spoken to trustees who say, my union would want things of me that are not in the best interests of this plan. When there were surpluses, shock and horror, unions might say, hey, yeah, let's divide those up. And a company would say, yeah, let's take a contribution holiday. Neither of those things are in the best interest of the plan. Reinvestment is in the best interest of the plan. So that gets difficult. But trustees a lot of trustees are out on a limb, and they work incredibly hard to get up to speed and to learn what they need to learn, but they're not well supported, despite a number of programs out there that are trying to do education and things like that. I don't know about confidentiality agreements. Some pension board meetings are public. Anyone could go to them. Some in the States I know of, they've invited me to attend. Oh, you want to come and see the board meeting? I'm not totally clear on the context of that in Canada. It does sometimes get a little complicated in a relationship with bargaining, and sometimes labor trustees are seen as these conduits of information that shouldn't be happening. But in a way, if you're a public sector pension plan, this information should not be hidden. Right? So, but I'm not totally clear.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Eileen Galazy, I always say the name wrong, has written a paper on about a year or two ago on the thorny question of disclosure, and confidentiality issues will be wrapped up in that. And she said, after all the case law we've had on when you disclose, what you disclose, how you communicate with beneficiaries and so forth, here's some of the issues. And she lines it up in a very doctrinal sort of analysis, so it's a resource for you.
That's Eileen Gillies?
How do I say it?
Gillies.
Gillies, okay.
Gillies.
Your question to me was, what do you get when you take this slice of the economy approach to investing, or comment on it? I mean, if you like the way market capitalism works right now, then it makes sense to adopt the position that we should grow more of it like that. And
if we're troubled by it.
Well, and it leads to Murray's question, or point is, is the role of these things corrective, or in a sense just there to provide the pension with a status quo view, as it were, towards how you make money in society. And it's a fundamental, I guess, paradox or tension at the heart of these pools of capital. A lot of hopes invested in them with diverse sort of ways to implement them. But for me, as a lawyer and then as sort of sometimes legal academic, the discussion is very interesting for me about the expectations of what law can do for you in that. And I think Murray was cautioning at the beginning for one of this sort of similar reason. what does law do in these situations, and what role does it have in either changing behavior or enabling behavior? The way I don't know if I was just trained this way, or the way I view common law or fiduciary duties, contracts, they're what the parties would have otherwise wanted to have happened. They're an expression of a desired relationship and outcome. And then you try and a court might hold them to that promise, or hold them to that expectation. If you're looking at criminal law statutes, they're there to make sure certain things don't happen, hopefully, and there's a police force and a judiciary backing that up so that hopefully it doesn't happen, and even then it does happen, but it's there as a sort of corrective measure. And the two aren't always distinguished, and lawyers, you get confused talking about them, and you get confused people coming at them, and so I don't think we do a good enough job about explaining what we can do that way or what law does that way. And these are open debates within legal theory circles and the rest of it. But unfortunately, whatever the role of it is, I think that the sort of broad stroke stylized economic facts are there's 10 or 15 really large pension funds in Canada, really, really big, globally big, large pools of capital. They're as big as the banks or close to it kind of thing. And they are in the position of owning these securities, and either the market puts them there, or the participating stakeholders want to put them there, or there's going to have to be a reckoning about how they're managed and the different perspectives of it. So, we're going to have to train trustees. We're going to have to face the questions of what their role will be, whether it's preventative, let's do no harm kind of thing, whether it's activist, let's go out and try and be corrective, even though I would say the legal architecture is not there to support you doing that. Marie's also said that's a government problem. That's the biggest collectivity's problem, not just a pool of capital's problem. With the retreat of the state, and we can go to conferences and hear this again and again, actors are going to have to solve their own problems this way. And these are big institutional actors, and understanding the internal workings of them and what they can do and what they shouldn't do. It's an ongoing chestnut. There's absolutely nothing I can say as a lawyer to fix it, but to at least say that we have to face it and noodle through it. I think that's something we have to do.
Very good.
Okay, quickly, Kevin's question about private equity, I don't think there's anything in the PRI that would be in conflict with shutting the factory in Quebec and moving it to South Carolina. That's not really what the PRI are about.
That's right.
We know what the social consequences are in Quebec, and we can imagine what they might be in South Carolina, but the PRI are really about the pension fund being able to make a holistic decision based on a wider range of criteria, but there's still risk and return-based decisions. So at the end of the day, considering all the social factors, makes sense from an economic point of view, from a cost and benefit point of view, from a risk-return point of view, to shut that factory in Quebec and move it to South Carolina. That's what the pension fund's going to do, because that's how they're going to understand their fiduciary obligation. The PRI doesn't even attempt to change that. All it attempts to do is to say, when you're looking at an acquisition or a transaction, consider, don't be controlled by, but consider the environmental, social, and governance factors. So that's one thing. Now, is any large fund, what are the large funds doing? Because I don't want to paint a picture that they're doing nothing. What amused me when the PRI were first introduced is the way they were described. They were brought on very cautiously, and they were described as aspirational goals. And I scratch my head and I say, I understand what a goal is, I understand what an aspiration is. When you put these two things together, aspirational goal, exactly what is this? What kind of commitment are you asking for? And of course, the reason they did this is because they wanted people to sign, they wanted people to join, they were less concerned about them doing anything immediately. And they thought, well, if we can, build a little momentum and get people on side, then, maybe this will be taken a little bit more seriously. But it's telling that the PRI began life as a set of aspirational goals. But again, I don't want to say that they're doing nothing. So you saw teachers the other day say, look, unless publicly traded corporations have at least 3 women on the board, they should be delisted in the stock exchange. Yeah, well, that's something, right? To a lot of people, that's important. The say-on-pay rules, which are exasperating for a number of reasons, but they're the essence of the say-on-pay resolution is that you put before the shareholders of a corporation a non-binding vote as to whether executive compensation is yea or nay. It's not binding, but it's indicative. It's at least putting it out there. The pension funds tend to support those. So they're getting a high vote. Not all of them do, but some of them do. So and what's the significance of that? I mean, the significance is not earth-shattering. This is not going to change the world, but there is a space where things can move at the margin of this economy and of this financial economy, and pension funds can play a better or a worse, a progressive, more progressive or a less progressive role. But to Kevin's point, the basic paradigm is intact. Right? It's not, and it's very much intact. It's very solidly rooted in a number of different ways, including the legal way through the fiduciary obligation. And there's really no attempt to change that. The attempt is to bring in other factors to better consider risk and return, social environmental factors. And laterally, the attempt is to make the system look out further than some of its dynamics compel it to do. Some of its dynamics are very immediate and short-term, quarter by quarter. And there are people who see that focusing so narrowly on such a short time frame is destructive, not only to the world, the economy, but to the firm. So that's
especially.
I'm sorry?
Especially to firms.
Especially.
Very good. Well, let me take the opportunity to thank the panel. I found this very interesting discussion, and I actually learned a whole lot more than I expected to, because I kind of talk to these guys all the time about these issues, thought I had a handle, but this was very interesting. I'm just going to add one little point. What I find so interesting, especially as Murray wrapped up, is at one point he's talking about, pension funds have the power to do this and they have this, but they don't have the power to do what the state does. And in fact, the gist of the message there, to my mind, is that the power of pension funds is very circumscribed by legal rules and by a whole lot of pressures and forces that contain what they can do. What I think is so important about that is that if I look at some of the literature and some of the discussion, even within the labor movement, there is, I think, some occasionally misguided sense that the power of the business class or the power that we face out there in the world is in the oversight of big piles of financial capital, and we've got pension funds, so our access to real power is somehow by gaining some sort of role in governance and overseeing it. And what I find helpful about this is that that's not really where the power lies. It's actually a very circumscribed and particular kind of power that, depending on our agency and our relationship to it, isn't necessarily the kind of power that I think we aspire to be able to exercise. And I just find that really helpfully clarifying. So let me close the discussion.